that you mentioned.
Right,
But yeah,
right, right.
first, okay, I'll try to sum this up as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
In 2017, there was something called the National Black Canadians Summit. I actually write about it in my book. This is a gathering hosted by the Michael Jean Foundation. Hundreds of Black people came. It was in Toronto at the Reference Library. And at that gathering, we were all introduced to a new group that said it was going to be the new advocacy group for Black Canadians. And it called itself the Federation of Black Canadians. So they were acting as though they were kind of like the co hosts or the big feature of this conference in 2017. And the first thing that happened was that their leader, their founder and chairperson, introduced himself and the group to everybody, the hundreds of people at that gathering. And that founder and spokesperson and chairperson is named Donald McLeod, and he is a judge in the Ontario court. I was sitting in the audience when this happened, and I was kind of like looking around, like, am I in the Twilight Zone right now? Like, what is going on? And the reason it felt so strange to me was that judges, by definition, are not allowed to engage in political advocacy. And yet, here is a judge standing here telling us that he has actually started his own political advocacy group. Now, to be clear, that's not the same as saying, like, well, I want to do community work. So, Justice McLeod also has a charity that he started called 100 Strong, where he mentors young boys, Black boys in his community. That's not the same thing as saying Black people have political needs that the government is not listening to. And I am going to be part of the solution in fighting and advocating for political changes. Why is that a problem? Why should anybody have a problem with that? Well, it's really simple. If you ever take like a basic civics course, the first thing that you're going to learn about, or one of the first things, is the division of powers in Canada. And
Hmm.
we have a judicial branch of government, which is judges like Justice McLeod. We have a legislative branch of government, which in the case of the federal government is parliament, or in the provincial government is the Ontario legislature, for example. And we have the executive, which is the head of government at the time. So Doug Ford is the premier of Ontario. Justin Trudeau is the executive leader of the federal government in Canada because he's the prime minister and he has a prime minister's office. And when you learn about civics, what you learn is that those branches of government are supposed to be separate from one another in certain ways. That if you are a judge, you have tremendous influence in the judicial branch already. You get to decide if people have freedom or not in a court case. You get to decide if people will be separated from their family, sent to jail, and have their freedoms taken away from them. And because you already have that tremendous power, to interpret the laws of Canada, you don't get to influence the making of the laws of Canada at the same time as you get to interpret them. So
Hmm.
judges don't do political advocacy because they already have a tremendous say on the law on the interpretation side. I thought this was weird that this judge now is presenting himself as political advocate. Not just me, though. Lots of people thought it was weird. And after a while, many articles were written about it. Lots of people were speaking up saying, I don't understand this. And by the way, it's not as though our Black community is like lacking of people who are completely capable of doing that work. So presenting it as this really high profile Black judge is going to do it because no one else is doing it for our community, I felt was like kind of insulting, actually. Like, we've got to have all the power consolidated into this one guy because no one else in our community is qualified to do anything. Like, that was the message. And whether it was intentionally the message or not, that's certainly how it came across to me and many other people. So, what
Hmm.
happened? The judge was found by his judicial council to have been engaging in the exact kind of political advocacy that you're not allowed to do. He was found to have been lobbying the government. He met with Justin Trudeau, with Gerald Butts, his chief of staff at the time, with Kathleen Wynne, who was premier at the time in Ontario, and with a whole bunch of federal Liberal cabinet ministers. And he didn't just meet with them, he had a whole series of proposals for funding and for government changes that he wanted. So he was doing the exact thing that I just said you're supposed to have a division of, not
Mm-hmm.
telling the legislative branch, here's how you legislate, here's how you make changes. That's not supposed to be a judge's job. Now, people might wonder, well, why do you care about that, Desmond? Why can't he just do whatever else? First of all, I'm a
Right.
journalist, so like this is my job. I'm
Right.
supposed to report on things like this, especially because I do care about the prospect of advocacy in our community. But yes, Justice McLeod went to a hearing in 2018. They said, you're lobbying. Lobbying is not compatible with your office, so please stop doing that. We're not going to find you guilty of misconduct, but you are lobbying and that can't happen anymore. Unfortunately for Justice McLeod, though, after that first ruling in 2018, he went back to engaging in the same kinds of activities. He went to a 2019 fundraising meeting, or sorry, a funding meeting, where the government said we have $25 million to distribute to the Black community. Justice McLeod was there on behalf of the FBC, like he took a plane or however he traveled. I don't know how maybe he took a train. I don't know, but he went to Gatineau, Quebec, from Toronto, from Brampton, to be like, let me talk about that $25 million on behalf of my Federation of Black Canadians. Like he knew he wasn't supposed to be doing things like that, and he continued.
Mm.
He also, unfortunately, did a couple of other things, which I reported on,
Yeah,
and
what were those things? What were those two things?
he started calling people in the community whose advocacy he didn't agree with. So when people were being critical of his advocacy, in the case of myself and some other people who were working on a really big deportation case at the time, and we were saying, look how this federal advocacy group does not say anything about this deportation case. Could it be that having a leader as a judge who is not supposed to do anything involving other courts was like really going to limit you talking about this federal court case of somebody being deported? I wonder, could that be a conflict? Obviously, it's a conflict. So, this is why judges don't put themselves at the head of advocacy groups, because then when we really need some advocacy, you're like, oh, I can't. I'm sorry. My hands are tied by my, job.
Mm-hmm.
He called a member of the advocacy team for that young man, Abdul Abdi, who was set to be deported. And he was mad that we were criticizing him and kind of criticizing the limits of his advocacy. He actually promised that he was going to do things to help Abdul. He never did those things, but he literally called someone up on the phone and said, hey, stop criticizing me so much. I'll help Abdul if you want me to. And he just did that to stop personal criticisms of him.
Mm.
And if you're an advocate, you have to accept. I get criticized in the public all the time. We're about to talk about a 2-page spread in the Toronto Star about me. Like, that's life. But you can't start using your privilege as a judge to call people and start being like, you shouldn't be criticizing me. He did it again in 2019. After being told to stop lobbying, Justice McLeod brought people to Parliament Hill in February of 2019 for an event that was called Lobby Day. Like, you can't make this up. And at that event, a whole bunch of people got racially profiled by a security guard. The security guard said some racist things to the Black people who were gathered, and obviously that made a lot of people angry. 2 of the people who were racially profiled started doing media and being like, this is awful, this is racism, we deserve an apology, and so forth. And because Justice McLeod was the one who invited them to his lobby day, and now they were speaking out in a way that was kind of embarrassing, he called them on the phone as well. And he told them, you guys need to stop being so loud. You need to stop doing this media. And if you don't stop, the parliamentary committee that's investigating this might actually decide to investigate you. That's quite a thing for somebody who's a judge to call people up and tell them. But these are the kind of things that I felt important to report on, not because they are necessarily judicial misconduct, but because as an activist myself, I just think that that's a horrible way to say that you're doing advocacy, to use your status as a judge so that when people disagree with you, you call them up on the phone and say, stop doing that or you're going to get in trouble by the state. That is so intimidating and inappropriate. And it's also a violation of your code of ethics as a judge. And I reported on those things. There was a second hearing this year, and they found that calling those two people on the phone was incompatible with judicial office. They found that going to that meeting about federal funding for $25 million in Gatineau was incompatible with judicial office. But they said, despite all those things, we're going to give you yet another chance. Just stop doing all of these things. Please stop. And that's been where all of the criticism has come against me, because I continued to report on this judge who continued to behave in some really questionable ways. And I guess people who support him think that because he's Black and I'm Black, that I'm some kind of traitor. Not that he has a responsibility, but the responsibility is all on me, interestingly, to not tell everyone what he was up to, even though he kept doing it. And you can imagine how I feel about that.
Just to sort of summarize, if I make sure I understand, the audience understands, essentially the reviews that happened, he, let's say, got a slap on the wrist, but wasn't deemed to sort of be unbecoming of his position.
That's right. So what they say is that there are things that you can do that are compatible with your office as a judge, and then there are things that are incompatible. So they said lobbying is incompatible. Going to funding meetings is incompatible. Calling people up when you're a judge and telling them, hey, you'll be investigated if you don't get on the right side, incompatible. But the line is misconduct. So these things are incompatible with judicial office, but in order to find somebody guilty of misconduct, Joel, you have to show that what they've done has undermined the public's confidence in the judiciary. And the hearing panels in both cases said it's bad, but it's not so bad that it undermines the confidence of the public, so you're free to go. Now, that's what they decided, and that's their decision. But for me, as a Black person in community, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in me as a person that somebody is repeatedly doing behaviors like this and is not being held to account. So if they're not going to be held to account in the court, they at least need to be held in account in the pages of publications like my own, a Black-focused publication called Cole's Notes that has been my baby for, 11, 12, 13 years. I've never made a dime off of Cole's Notes. I don't get paid. There's no ads on it. I do that work for our community to tell them what's going on, because I think that is a form of accountability. And I'm not interested in whether or not the court thought that what Justice McLeod did was against their rules. For me, ethically, I'm like, you can't treat people in our community like that and expect not to have anybody talk about it. So that was what I did.
Now, I think the last time we did the episode, there was an understanding that he had also stepped down, at least formally, from that organization. Is that?
Yeah, this is actually quite interesting, because while the first hearing was being investigated, Justice McLeod's leadership asked him to step down from the FBC. He said, I don't want to do that. I have no intention of doing that. They still need me. And then the Ontario Judicial Council came back and said, okay, if you don't step down, we might suspend you without pay. And that changed his mind. And so then Justice McLeod did resign from the Federation of Black Canadians. He came back after the first hearing decision occurred, and they gave him a different title. But, I wasn't just reporting on some, news articles that I saw. I did really deep investigative research into the organization, the Federation of Black Canadians. I talked to former staff members who had left, former volunteers who had left the group, and they all told me that this man is still making a lot of the decisions, even though he doesn't have the same chairperson title that he did before. Now, the Ontario Judicial Council didn't say don't go back to the group, but I certainly don't think that they expected him to go back and start making these kinds of phone calls to people and going to funding meetings, which is unfortunately what he decided to do.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, it's pretty clear cut, I think, from a workplace point of view. Like, your job has rules. You broke the rules of your job. You're an extremely powerful person, though. So if you'd expect to be a powerful person breaking the rules of their job, and that a journalist, black or any other color, wouldn't report on you. That's really weird. That's my work. That's my job, is to hold powerful people to account for the decisions that they make and the behaviors that they engage in. And I know that hurts a lot of people in the Black community because they think, well, we need that leadership, but not at all costs. We do need leadership, but not at the cost of letting people engage in whatever behavior they want because we think that they are indispensable, that they are too important to be held to the same standards as everybody else. That is very dangerous. And that's what I've always been worried about in my work.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.